The morning Quinn Yates stumbled upon a woman kneeling in the dirt beside a fallen sparrow. He had been contemplating whether life held anything worth living for anymore. His broad shoulders hunched against the September wind that swept through the Wyoming mountains in 1879, and his calloused hands gripped the rifle slung across his back with the familiarity of a man who had known more sorrow than joy. His dark hair, grown long past his collar over months of isolation, whipped around a face weathered by grief and wilderness, and his muscular frame moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to trust nothing. He had been heading into Rawlins for supplies, his first trip to civilization in nearly 4 months since his wife and infant daughter had died during a difficult childbirth, leaving him hollow and aching in a cabin that echoed with their absence. But there, in a clearing just off the mountain trail, bathed in golden morning light, knelt a woman with copper hair braided down her back, her slender fingers carefully scooping earth around a tiny bundle, wrapped in what looked like part of her own petticoat. Quinn halted his horse and watched, transfixed, as she worked with such tender care over something so small and seemingly insignificant. Most folks would have stepped over a dead bird without a second glance, but this woman was creating a proper grave, her lips moving in what appeared to be a whispered prayer. "Rest easy, little one," she murmured, her voice carrying on the wind. "You flew as far as you could, and that was enough." Something in those words pierced through the armor Quinn had built around his heart. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on pine needles, and she looked up with startled green eyes that held both wariness and an inexplicable gentleness. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a face that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. Dirt smudged her cheek, and her simple brown traveling dress was dusty from the road. "Did not mean to frighten you, miss," Quinn said, his voice rusty from disuse. He stood a respectful distance away, aware of how he must look after months in the mountains. His beard had grown thick, his buckskin clothing was worn, and he towered over most men with his 6'4" frame packed with muscle from years of hard living. "Just passing through." She studied him for a long moment, her hand still cupped around the small grave. "You are welcome to pass, then. I will be finished here shortly." But Quinn did not move. He watched as she patted the earth gently and placed a small circle of stones around the burial site. "That is a lot of care for a sparrow." "Every living thing deserves to be honored in death," she replied, brushing dirt from her hands as she stood. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5'8", with a willowy grace that reminded him of the aspen trees that grew in the high country. Even the smallest among us matters. Quinn felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. He had not been able to cry at his own family's funeral, had stood stone-faced while the preacher spoke empty words, had walked away from their graves without looking back because the pain was too immense to bear. But this stranger wept for a bird, tears tracking clean lines through the dust on her face. "You heading to Rawlins?" he asked, noticing the small carpet bag sitting a few yards away near a formation of rocks. No horse, no wagon, just her and that single bag. "I was," she said, hesitation coloring her tone. "My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. I had to leave him with a rancher who said he would get the blacksmith out from town. I have been walking since dawn." Quinn glanced at the sun, now climbing higher in the clear September sky. 5 miles was no small distance, especially for a woman alone in country that could turn dangerous without warning. "That is a long walk. You should not be traveling these roads by yourself." "I had little choice," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I am expected in Rawlins by this afternoon. I have taken a position as a schoolteacher there." A schoolteacher? Of course she was. Only someone with learning and gentleness would stop to bury a bird with such reverence. Quinn found himself wanting to know more, wanting to understand what had brought her to this rough territory, what had put that mixture of determination and sadness in her eyes. "I am heading that way myself," he said. "You could ride with me if you are comfortable with it. My horse is strong enough to carry both of us and your bag." She regarded him carefully, weighing the risks of accepting help from a mountain man who looked half wild against the dangers of continuing alone on foot. Quinn waited, not pushing, understanding that trust had to be earned, especially out here where a woman's safety depended on her judgment of character. "What is your name?" she finally asked. "Quinn Yates. I have a cabin about 15 miles north of here, up in the high country. I trap mostly, sell furs in town when I need supplies." "Penelope Ashford," she said, extending her hand with a formality that seemed out of place in the wilderness, but which Quinn found oddly touching. He shook it gently, aware of how small her hand felt in his rough palm, how delicate her fingers were compared to his work-hardened ones. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Yates. I will accept, if you truly do not mind the inconvenience." "No inconvenience," Quinn said, surprised to find he meant it. For the first time in months, he felt something other than the crushing weight of grief. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple human need for connection that he had been denying himself in his self-imposed exile. He retrieved her carpetbag and secured it behind his saddle, then mounted his large bay gelding and reached down to help Penelope up. She settled behind him with an awkwardness that suggested she was not accustomed to riding double, her hands hovering uncertainly before finally gripping his waist lightly. Quinn tried not to notice the warmth of her touch through his shirt, tried not to think about how long it had been since anyone had touched him with anything other than pity or fear. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the steady clip of hooves on packed earth and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Quinn was acutely aware of Penelope behind him, the slight weight of her against his back when the trail grew rough, the scent of lavender soap that clung to her despite the dust of travel. "Why did you really stop?" Penelope asked suddenly. "Back there at the clearing. You said you were passing through, but you stopped and watched me." Quinn considered his answer carefully. He was not a man prone to sharing his thoughts, had grown even more guarded since Sarah and little Margaret had died. But something about Penelope's directness, her willingness to ask the questions others would dance around, made him want to be honest. "I was thinking about death when I came upon you," he admitted, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "About how much of it I have seen, how tired I am of it. Then there you were, treating that bird with more kindness than most people show each other. It made me stop and wonder." "Wonder what?" Her voice was soft, curious rather than prying. If there was still good in the world worth noticing. Penelope was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her words were measured, thoughtful. "I think there's always good worth noticing, Mr. Yates. Sometimes we have to look harder to find it, especially when we are hurting. But it is there." Quinn felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. "You lost someone too," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she whispered. "My sister. 6 months ago. Consumption took her slowly, and I could do nothing but watch her fade. I think that is why I stopped for the bird. I could not save Clara, but I could make sure that Sparrow was not left alone and forgotten." They rode on, the landscape opening up as they descended from the higher elevations toward the valley, where Rawlins sat nestled against the rolling prairie. Quinn found himself talking more than he had in months, telling Penelope about his cabin, about the winters in the mountains, about the wildlife and the solitude. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly hearing him rather than just filling silence with empty chatter. In turn, Penelope told him about her journey from Pennsylvania, about the teaching position she had secured through correspondence, about her hope to start fresh in a place where everyone did not look at her with pity every time they saw her face. She spoke of her love for books and learning, of her dream to help children discover the wonder of education, of her fear that she might not be strong enough for the harsh realities of frontier life. "You are stronger than you think," Quinn said, surprising himself with his certainty. "Anyone who can walk 5 miles alone and still stop to bury a bird with kindness, who can lose a sister and still believe in good, that is strength, Miss Ashford. Maybe not the kind that shows in muscles, but the kind that matters more." He felt her grip on his waist tighten slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his words. They crested a final rise, and Rawlins spread out before them, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that represented civilization in this wild country. The town had grown since the Union Pacific Railroad had come through a decade earlier, transforming it from a remote outpost to a bustling hub for ranchers, miners, and everyone else trying to make their fortune in Wyoming territory. Quinn guided his horse down the main street, aware of the curious looks they were drawing. He rarely came to town, and when he did, folks tended to give him a wide berth. He knew what they saw: a mountain man who looked more animal than human, dangerous and unpredictable. But with Penelope riding behind him, some of those wary looks shifted to speculation and gossip. He could already hear the whispers starting, the questions about who she was and what she meant to him. "The boarding house is just ahead," Penelope said, pointing to a 2-story structure with a fresh coat of white paint. "Mrs. Henderson arranged lodging for me there until I can find more permanent quarters." Quinn pulled up in front of the building and dismounted, then helped Penelope down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he was careful to set her on her feet gently before stepping back. She smoothed her skirts and tucked a strand of copper hair behind her ear, suddenly looking nervous. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she said formally. "Your kindness today was unexpected and greatly appreciated." Quinn retrieved her carpetbag and handed it to her, feeling an odd reluctance to see her go. "You are welcome, Miss Ashford. I hope the teaching goes well for you." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. "Perhaps I will see you again when you come to town for supplies." "Perhaps," Quinn agreed, though he was already planning to return sooner than his usual schedule would require. He watched as she climbed the steps to the boarding house, watched until she disappeared inside with a final wave, and only then did he realize he was already thinking about excuses to come back. The owner of the general store, Albert Morrison, raised his eyebrows when Quinn walked in, asking for supplies he did not really need. "Saw you ride in with the new schoolteacher," Albert said with the lack of subtlety that characterized small-town gossips everywhere. "Pretty thing. Awful nice of you to help her." "Just doing what any decent person would," Quinn replied gruffly, gathering items at random. Coffee, flour, sugar, things he already had enough of at the cabin, but bought anyway to justify the trip. Sure, Albert said with a knowing grin that made Quinn want to walk out. "You planning on being in town long?" "Just today," Quinn said, then hesitated. "Where's the schoolhouse located?" If Albert's grin got any wider, it would split his face. "Edge of town, near the church. Miss Ashford is supposed to meet with the school board this afternoon to go over her duties. Heard Mrs. Henderson say the woman walked 5 miles this morning. That is dedication for you." Quinn grunted non-committally and paid for his purchases. He told himself he was not going to ride past the schoolhouse on his way out of town. He told himself that Penelope Ashford was none of his business. that his interest was just the idle curiosity of a lonely man who had spoken to another human being for the first time in months. He told himself a lot of things, and then he found his horse heading toward the edge of town anyway. The schoolhouse was a simple structure, freshly built from the look of it, with large windows to let in light and a small bell tower on top. Penelope stood outside talking with a group of stern-faced men and women who Quinn recognized as some of Rawlins' more prominent citizens. She looked small next to them, but she held her ground with a confidence that impressed him. He did not stop, did not want to interrupt or cause her any trouble by association. But as he rode past, she glanced up and caught his eye. Her smile was brief but genuine, and Quinn carried that smile with him all the 15 miles back to his cabin, like a candle flame cupped against the wind. The cabin felt emptier than ever when he returned. Quinn put away his supplies mechanically, his mind still full of copper hair and green eyes and the gentle way Penelope had buried that sparrow. He had been existing rather than living for 4 months now, going through the motions of survival without any real purpose or joy. But today had cracked something open inside him, had reminded him that the world contained more than just grief and loss. That night, lying in his bunk staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, Quinn allowed himself to think about Sarah and Margaret for the first time since their deaths, without immediately shutting down the memories. He let himself remember the good times, the laughter, the love they had shared. And for the first time, he let himself cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his muscular frame and left him exhausted but somehow lighter. In the morning, he rose before dawn and did something he had not done in months. He cleaned. He swept the cabin floor, washed the dishes that had been piling up, aired out the blankets, and scraped the worst of the dirt from his clothes. He trimmed his beard and cut his hair to a more manageable length using Sarah's sewing scissors and a piece of broken mirror. The face that looked back at him was still haggard, still marked by grief, but it was human again. Quinn told himself he was just taking better care of himself, that it had nothing to do with a woman he had met for a few hours. But he knew he was lying. Penelope had seen him at his worst, had not flinched from his rough appearance or wild demeanor, had treated him with respect and kindness. And more than that, she had shown him through her actions that even in death and sorrow, there could be grace and gentleness. If she could stop to honor a fallen sparrow, maybe he could learn to honor his own grief while still choosing to live. The days passed slowly in the cabin. Quinn tended his trap lines, prepared for the coming winter, and tried not to think about how long it would be before he had a legitimate reason to return to Rawlins. But 3 weeks after their first meeting, an early October snowstorm swept down from the mountains with unexpected ferocity. Quinn had weathered worse. But as he secured his cabin and brought his horse into the small shelter he had built, he found himself thinking about Penelope in her boarding house room, wondering if she was warm enough, if she had everything she needed. When the storm cleared 2 days later, leaving the high country blanketed in fresh snow, Quinn made a decision. He saddled his horse, loaded his saddlebags with furs to sell, and headed to Rawlins. It was earlier than his usual schedule, and his supplies were still adequate. But he could not shake the feeling that he needed to see her, to make sure she was all right, to talk to her again. The ride took longer than usual with snow on the ground, and by the time Quinn reached town, the school day was ending. He timed it poorly on purpose, arriving just as children began spilling out of the schoolhouse door, their voices high and excited with the freedom of afternoon. Quinn hung back, not wanting to interrupt, but Penelope spotted him almost immediately. She said something to the last few lingering students, then walked toward him with that same graceful stride he remembered. She wore a deep blue dress today, practical but flattering, and her copper hair was pinned up in a style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. "Mr. Yates," she said warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. I had wondered if you weathered the storm all right up in the mountains." "Takes more than a little snow to trouble me," Quinn said, then felt foolish for sounding so gruff. "But I wanted to make sure you were settled in properly. First storms of the season can be hard on folks new to the territory." Penelope's smile suggested she saw right through his excuse, but she did not call him on it. "That is very considerate of you. I confess the wind was quite fierce, but Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is sturdy and warm. Would you like to come inside the schoolhouse? I was just tidying up, and I could make us some coffee." Quinn tied his horse and followed her into the building. The interior was neat and orderly, with rows of wooden desks facing a large chalkboard. Books lined shelves along one wall, and children's drawings decorated another. It smelled of chalk dust and paper, and the faint scent of lavender that he now associated with Penelope. She busied herself with a small stove in the corner, preparing coffee while Quinn stood awkwardly by a window. He was not used to being indoors in civilized places, not used to making small talk or pretending he had not ridden 15 miles through snow just to see her. "How are the children?" he asked, grasping for something to say. "Wonderful," Penelope replied, her face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "Some are more challenging than others, of course, but they are eager to learn. I have students ranging from 6 to 14, all different skill levels. It keeps me busy, but I love it." She handed him a tin cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Quinn caught the faint scent of lavender again and realized it must be from the soap she used. He took a sip of the coffee to cover his sudden nervousness, then nearly scalded his tongue because he had not been paying attention to how hot it was. Penelope pretended not to notice his discomfort, settling into the chair behind her desk with her own cup. "Tell me about the mountains in winter," she said. "I have heard it can be quite isolating up there." Quinn leaned against the windowsill, grateful for a topic he could discuss without stumbling over his words. "It is quiet," he said. "Snow gets deep, sometimes up to the cabin windows. You learn to prepare, to stock enough supplies to last until spring. The wildlife moves to lower elevations mostly, but you still see elk, sometimes wolves. The silence is the strangest part, so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat." "That sounds both beautiful and lonely," Penelope observed. "It is both," Quinn admitted. "I have not minded it these past months. The loneliness, I mean. After my wife and daughter died, I wanted the silence. Needed it, maybe. But lately I have been thinking that too much silence is not good for a person either." Penelope set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. "I am glad you came to town today, Mr. Yates. And I am glad you stopped that morning when you found me burying the bird. I have thought about you often, wondered how you were managing up there alone." Quinn felt his heart rate pick up. "You have?" "Of course. It is not every day you meet someone who understands grief without needing it explained. Someone who does not offer empty platitudes or tell you that time heals all wounds." "Does it?" Quinn asked. "Heal wounds, I mean." "Time." Penelope considered the question seriously. "I think time teaches us to live with the wounds. They scar over, become part of us, but they do not disappear entirely. And maybe that is how it should be. The people we lose deserve to be remembered, to have left a mark on us." They talked until the light began to fade, and Penelope needed to return to the boarding house for supper. Quinn walked with her through the quiet streets, carrying her school bag and listening as she told him about her students, about the families she was meeting, about the challenges and joys of frontier teaching. At the boarding house steps, she turned to him with what looked like resolve. "Mr. Yates, would you consider having supper with me tomorrow evening? Nothing fancy, just a meal at the restaurant. I would like to repay your kindness, and I confess I would enjoy the company." Quinn's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to his safe isolation, but looking at Penelope's hopeful face, remembering the warmth of conversation and human connection, he found himself nodding. "I would like that, Miss Ashford. What time?" 6 o'clock, she suggested. "At Miller's restaurant, just down the street." "I will be there," Quinn promised. He spent the night at the livery stable's rooming house, a simple arrangement but cheaper than the hotel. Sleep came fitfully, his mind too active with thoughts of the next evening. He woke early and went to the barber for a proper shave and trim, then bought a new shirt from the general store because his buckskin clothing seemed too rough for a restaurant dinner. Albert Morrison did not even try to hide his amusement. "Heard you were sparking the schoolteacher," he said cheerfully while wrapping the shirt. "Good for you, Quinn. About time you rejoined the living." Quinn scowled, but did not deny it. The truth was, he felt more alive than he had in months, more aware of his surroundings and more interested in what the next day might bring. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He spent the day selling his furs and restocking actual supplies he needed, and when 6 o'clock approached, he found himself nervous as a schoolboy. He arrived at Miller's restaurant a few minutes early and waited outside until he saw Penelope walking toward him. She wore a green dress that matched her eyes and had done something different with her hair, leaving it partially down so copper waves framed her face. "You look beautiful," Quinn said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Penelope's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Yates." "Quinn," he said, "if we are having supper together, you should call me Quinn." "Only if you call me Penelope," she replied with a smile. The restaurant was busy, but not crowded, and they found a table near the window where they could watch evening settle over Rollins. They ordered simple fare, steak and potatoes, and fell into conversation as easily as they had the day before. Penelope told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about growing up with her sister Clara, about their shared love of reading and learning. Quinn found himself sharing more about his own past than he had intended, about his early years trapping with his father, about meeting Sarah at a church social in Cheyenne, about building the cabin where they had planned to raise a family. "I thought I had my whole life figured out," Quinn said quietly, pushing food around his plate. "A wife, a daughter, a future." Then it was all gone in one night. The midwife said complications, said there was nothing anyone could have done. But I keep thinking about all the things I should have done differently, all the ways I failed them. Penelope reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You did not fail them, Quinn. Sometimes terrible things happen, and there is no one to blame, no way to prevent it. I learned that watching Clara die. I was with her every day, did everything the doctor said, prayed until my knees were bruised from kneeling. But she still slipped away, and I had to learn that loving someone is not the same as being able to save them." Quinn turned his hand over so their palms met, his rough fingers intertwining with her smooth ones. "How do you keep going? How do you get up every morning and teach those children and smile like the world has not gutted you?" "Because giving up would dishonor her memory," Penelope said simply. "Clara loved life, loved learning, loved children. She wanted to be a teacher too, did I tell you that? So I teach for both of us. And some days it is hard, some days I cry myself to sleep. But other days I see a child's face light up when they master reading or mathematics. And I think Clara would have loved this moment. Those moments make it worth continuing. They sat in the restaurant long after they finished eating, reluctant to end the evening. When they finally stepped outside into the cool October night, Quinn offered his arm, and Penelope took it without hesitation. They walked slowly back to the boarding house, taking the long way around town as if by mutual agreement. "I come to Rollins about once a month in winter," Quinn said as they approached her door. "More often the rest of the year. I was wondering if maybe when I am in town, you might want to spend some time together. I know you are busy with teaching, but perhaps supper again, or a walk, or whatever you would like." Penelope smiled up at him, her face illuminated by lamplight from the boarding house windows. "I would like that very much, Quinn. In fact, I was hoping you might ask." Quinn felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Good," he said. "That is good." He left the next morning before dawn, riding back up into the mountains with a lighter heart than he had carried in months. The cabin did not seem quite so empty anymore, and the silence felt more peaceful than oppressive. He went about his work with renewed purpose, checking his trap lines, cutting firewood for the winter, repairing equipment that he had been neglecting. But his thoughts kept returning to Penelope, to her gentle strength and understanding heart, to the way she had held his hand across the table and made him feel less alone. He had not been looking for love, had not thought himself capable of it after losing Sarah. But what he felt for Penelope was different from what he had felt for his late wife. Sarah had been his first love, young and passionate and full of dreams. What he was beginning to feel for Penelope was deeper, tempered by shared grief and mutual understanding, built on a foundation of respect and genuine connection. 3 weeks later, Quinn returned to Rollins with a purpose beyond supplies. He had spent hours carving a small wooden box from cedar, inlaying the lid with a delicate pattern of leaves and flowers. It was not much, but it was the first thing he had created with his hands that was not purely functional. The first time in months he had made something beautiful, simply because he wanted to. Penelope's face lit up when he presented it to her after school. "Quinn, this is exquisite," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this yourself?" "Figured you could use it for your personal things," Quinn said, suddenly shy about the gift. "It has a small lock to keep it secure." She looked up at him with shining eyes. "It is the most thoughtful gift anyone has given me. Thank you." They fell into a pattern over the following months. Quinn would arrive in Rollins every few weeks, and they would spend whatever time Penelope could spare from teaching together. They walked the town streets bundled against the winter cold, attended church services on Sundays, shared meals at Miller's restaurant, or sometimes at the boarding house when Mrs. Henderson invited Quinn to join them. Quinn found himself talking to Penelope about things he had never discussed with anyone: his dreams and fears, his guilt over surviving when his family had not, his uncertainty about the future. She listened without judgment, offering insights from her own experience with loss, helping him see that moving forward did not mean forgetting or dishonoring Sarah and Margaret's memory. In turn, Penelope confided her own struggles to Quinn: the loneliness of being new in town, the challenges of teaching children whose families sometimes did not value education, her fear that she was not strong enough or brave enough for frontier life. Quinn reassured her with quiet certainty, pointing out all the ways she demonstrated strength every day, how the children clearly adored her, how she had made a place for herself in Rollins through determination and kindness. Winter deepened, and Quinn's visits sometimes stretched to 2 or 3 days when weather and obligations allowed. He began doing odd jobs around town, helping repair fences or chop wood for families who needed it. partly for extra money, but mostly as an excuse to stay near Penelope. The town's initial suspicion of him gradually softened as people saw how he treated the schoolteacher with respect and gentleness, how he was willing to help without asking for payment, how the wild mountain man was perhaps not so wild after all. On a clear January afternoon, Quinn took Penelope on a sleigh ride borrowed from a friendly rancher. They bundled under thick blankets and drove out of town into the snow-covered valley. The world transformed into something magical by winter's touch. Penelope laughed with delight as they skimmed over the snow, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Her cheeks flushed pink with cold and happiness. Quinn pulled the sleigh to a stop on a small rise overlooking Rawlins. The town looked tiny from this distance, a small collection of buildings dwarfed by the immense landscape. Penelope leaned against him, and Quinn wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close for warmth. "I have been thinking," Penelope said softly, "about how strange life is, how you can plan and dream and work towards something, and then everything changes in an instant. 6 months ago, I was in Pennsylvania burying my sister. Now I am here in Wyoming with you, and I am happy. I did not think I would be happy again, but I am." Quinn tightened his arm around her. "I did not think I would be either. When I found you burying that bird, I was on my way to town for the first time since I buried my wife and daughter. I was not sure I would make it there, was not sure I cared about anything anymore. Then I saw you showing so much care for something so small, and it made me think that maybe the world was not entirely dark." Penelope turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "Do you think they would approve? Sarah and Margaret? Of us being together like this?" It was a question Quinn had asked himself many times in the quiet of his cabin. "I think Sarah would want me to live, not just exist. She had a generous heart, loved fiercely and without reservation. She would not want me to spend the rest of my life alone and miserable." "And Margaret?" His voice caught slightly. "She never had a chance to live at all. But if she had, I would want her to know love and joy and all the good things life can offer. How can I deny myself what I would have wanted for her? Clara used to say that the best way to honor the dead was to live fully for them," Penelope said. "To grab joy with both hands because they cannot. I think she would like you, Quinn. She always appreciated people who were genuine, who did not hide behind social niceties." "I am not very good at social niceties," Quinn admitted with a small smile. "No," Penelope agreed, her eyes sparkling. "But you are good at being honest and kind and brave. Those matter much more." Quinn cupped her face with his hand, his calloused thumb gently stroking her cheek. "Penelope, I need you to know that I care for you deeply. I did not plan this. Did not think I could feel this way again. But you have become essential to me. When I am up in the mountains, I count the days until I can see you again. When we are together, I feel like I can finally breathe properly. I know it is soon. I know we have only been acquainted a few months. But I need you to know how I feel." Penelope's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I care for you too, Quinn. So much that it frightens me sometimes. I thought my heart was too broken to love again. But you proved me wrong. You are the strongest, gentlest man I have ever known. And being with you feels like coming home." Quinn kissed her then, softly at first, and then with growing intensity as months of loneliness and longing poured into that connection. Penelope's arms came up around his neck, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, both of them hungry for the warmth and comfort and love they had been denied for too long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. Give you time to be certain. Let folks in town get used to the idea. But Penelope, I need you to know that my intentions are serious. When I look at you, I see a future I thought I had lost forever." "Then court me," Penelope said, her voice shaky with emotion. "Take whatever time you need to be certain. I am not going anywhere." They drove back to town as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Quinn left Penelope at the boarding house with another kiss, this one sweet and full of promise, and rode back to his cabin with his heart fuller than he had thought possible. The next months were the happiest Quinn could remember, even considering his early years with Sarah. He made the trip to Rawlins twice as often, timing his visits to Penelope's schedule so they could spend maximum time together. He met her students and was charmed by their obvious affection for their teacher. He attended town socials and church picnics, slowly becoming part of the community rather than the isolated mountain man people whispered about. In March, when the snow began to melt and early wildflowers pushed through the soggy earth, Quinn brought Penelope up to his cabin for the first time. He had spent days preparing, cleaning everything thoroughly, making repairs he had been putting off, wanting her to see it at its best. The cabin was simple but sturdy. One large room with a sleeping area partitioned by a curtain, a stone fireplace that kept everything warm, and large windows that looked out over a spectacular valley view. Penelope walked through slowly, taking in every detail. Quinn watched her nervously, seeing his home through her eyes, wondering if she found it too rough, too isolated, too much a reminder that his life was very different from what she was accustomed to. "It is beautiful, Quinn," she said finally, standing by the window to look out at the mountains. "I can see why you love it here. It is so peaceful, so removed from everything." "Too removed?" Quinn asked, voicing his fear. "I know teaching is important to you, and the school is in Rawlins. I have been thinking about that, about how we could make things work if—" He stopped, not quite ready to voice the hope that had been growing in his heart. Penelope turned to face him, understanding in her eyes. "If we got married?" she finished gently. Quinn swallowed hard. "I have not asked you yet. I wanted to wait until I was certain you knew what you would be getting into, what life with me would be like." "Quinn Yates," Penelope said, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "I have known what I would be getting into since you helped me down from your horse that first day in Rawlins. I would be getting a man who is brave and kind, who understands grief but chooses to live anyway, who carves beautiful boxes just because he wants to give someone a gift. I would be getting someone who makes me feel safe and cherished and understood. If you are asking what I think you are asking, my answer is yes." Quinn felt tears prick his eyes, a rare occurrence for a man who had spent years hardening himself against emotion. "I have not asked properly yet," he said, his voice rough. "I do not even have a ring." "Then ask him properly," Penelope said, smiling through her own tears. "And we can worry about rings later." Quinn dropped to one knee, taking both her hands in his. "Penelope Ashford, will you marry me? Will you share this life with me, this cabin and these mountains, and whatever future we can build together? I cannot promise it will be easy, but I can promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Penelope said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in late May, when Wyoming's high country burst into bloom and the weather was warm enough for an outdoor celebration. The ceremony took place in front of the church in Rawlins, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Quinn wore a new suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but he barely noticed his discomfort because he could not take his eyes off Penelope in her simple white dress, a crown of wildflowers in her copper hair. Mrs. Henderson wept openly during the vows. Albert Morrison from the general store grinned knowingly and elbowed his wife as if to say he had seen this coming from the start. The children from Penelope's class threw flower petals and cheered when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Quinn kissed his bride while his heart felt too full for his chest. And for the first time since losing Sarah and Margaret, he allowed himself to believe in happiness again. They spent their wedding night at the cabin, making the long ride up into the mountains as the sun set behind them. Quinn carried Penelope over the threshold, a tradition he had not bothered with his first marriage, but that seemed important now. A way of marking this as a new beginning rather than a replacement for what had been lost. Penelope had agreed to continue teaching through the end of the school year, which meant spending weekdays at the boarding house and weekends at the cabin. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it allowed her to fulfill her commitment to her students while beginning to transition into her new life. Quinn made the ride back and forth several times a week, unable to bear being separated from his new wife for too long. During those golden summer months, they learned each other in ways both large and small. Quinn discovered that Penelope sang while she cooked, that she read late into the night by lamplight, that she had a quick temper when provoked but forgave easily. Penelope learned that Quinn was surprisingly tender for such a large, strong man, that he had nightmares sometimes but did not like to talk about them, that he showed love through actions more than words. They also learned to merge their separate griefs into a shared understanding. Quinn took Penelope to Sarah and Margaret's graves, a small plot near a creek about 5 miles from the cabin. It was the first time he had been back since the burial, and Penelope held his hand while he wept and spoke to his first wife and daughter, telling them about his new life, about how he would always love and remember them but was choosing to live again. In turn, Penelope told Quinn stories about Clara, sharing memories she had been keeping locked inside because talking about her sister had been too painful. Quinn listened and asked questions and helped her see that remembering did not have to hurt quite so much when the memories were shared. When fall arrived and the new school year began, Penelope had trained a replacement teacher, a young woman fresh from Denver who was eager to take over the position. Penelope gave her final lessons with tears in her eyes, hugging each of her students and making them promise to continue working hard. Then she said goodbye to the boarding house, packed up her few possessions, and moved permanently to the mountain cabin that was now her home. The transition was not without challenges. The cabin was isolated, and there were days when Penelope felt the weight of that isolation pressing on her. She missed the daily interaction with children, missed having neighbors close by, missed the social connections she had been building in Rawlins. Quinn understood her struggles and tried to make things easier, bringing her to town more often, encouraging her to invite friends up to the cabin, suggesting she might start a small lending library for the ranch families scattered throughout the valley. Penelope threw herself into creating a life in the mountains with the same determination she had brought to teaching. She improved the cabin, adding curtains and rugs and small touches that made it feel more like a home. She started a garden in the clearing near the house, planting vegetables and flowers and herbs. She learned to preserve food for winter, to cook on the wood stove, to shoot a rifle well enough to protect herself when Quinn was out on his trap lines. And slowly, gradually, she fell in love with the mountains as deeply as she loved the man who had brought her there. She loved the vast silence that allowed her to hear her own thoughts, the spectacular views that changed with every season, the wildlife that ventured near their cabin, the sense of being part of something ancient and enduring. In December, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn on Christmas morning, presenting him with tiny knitted booties she had been secretly making for weeks. Quinn's face went through a series of emotions, joy and fear and hope all tangled together, before he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his voice muffled against her hair. "After what happened to Sarah and Margaret, I cannot help being afraid." "I am afraid too," Penelope said honestly. "But we cannot let fear steal our joy, Quinn. This baby is a gift, a new beginning for both of us. And I am strong and healthy. We will get through this together." Quinn insisted on bringing a doctor up from Rawlins once a month to check on Penelope, paying the man generously for his time and expertise. He hovered over his wife like a mother hen, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a book, worrying about every twinge and ache. Penelope tolerated his overprotectiveness with patient good humor, understanding that it came from a place of love and loss. As winter deepened and Penelope's belly grew, they spent long evenings by the fire talking about their hopes for their child. Names were discussed and debated. Plans were made for converting part of the cabin into a nursery. Quinn began carving a cradle from smooth pine, working on it for hours each night until his hands cramped, determined to create something beautiful and lasting for their baby. Penelope's pregnancy progressed without complications, and by the time spring arrived, she was ready to welcome their child. Quinn had arranged for a midwife from Rawlins to stay at the cabin during the final weeks, an older woman named Martha who had delivered dozens of babies and exuded calm competence. On a warm May afternoon, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Penelope went into labor. Quinn paced the cabin floor while Martha tended to his wife, his mind full of terrible memories of the last time he had waited for a birth. But Penelope was strong, and the labor, while long, progressed normally. Just after midnight, as a full moon rose over the mountains, Quinn's son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to echo off the peaks. Martha cleaned and wrapped the baby, then placed him in Quinn's arms while she tended to Penelope. Quinn stared down at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers curled into fists, the shock of dark hair so like his own, and felt love crash over him like a wave. This child was alive and healthy, and Penelope had come through the birth tired but well, and Quinn had been given a second chance at the family he thought he had lost forever. "He is perfect," Penelope said weakly from the bed, her face pale but radiant with exhaustion and joy. "Bring him here so I can see him properly." Quinn carefully placed their son in Penelope's arms and sat beside her on the bed, his large frame taking up most of the available space, but neither of them caring. They examined their baby together, counting fingers and toes, marveling at his tiny features, falling completely and irrevocably in love. "What should we name him?" Penelope asked. Quinn thought about it, about all the names they had discussed, about tradition and hope and new beginnings. "What about James?" he suggested. "After your father, and Margaret for a middle name to honor my daughter." Tears filled Penelope's eyes. "James Margaret Yates," she said softly. "He will carry both our histories with him, both the love and the loss." "That is perfect, Quinn." The next weeks were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Quinn proved to be a natural father, his gentle touch and patient demeanor perfectly suited to caring for an infant. He walked the floor with James during fussy nights, changed diapers without complaint, and sang off-key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby better than anything else. Penelope recovered quickly from the birth, and within a month she was back to her regular routines, albeit with a baby strapped to her back or sleeping in the cradle Quinn had made. They had never been happier. Their little cabin full of laughter and love and the ordinary chaos of new parenthood. On a warm afternoon in June, Quinn was chopping wood while Penelope hung laundry and James slept in a basket under a shady tree. A flash of movement caught Quinn's eye, and he looked up to see a small bird fluttering on the ground nearby, one wing dragging awkwardly. It was injured, but alive, chirping weakly as it tried to fly. Penelope had seen it too. She abandoned the laundry and approached the bird carefully, making soothing sounds. Quinn watched as she gently scooped it up and examined it, her face full of the same compassion he had first witnessed almost 2 years ago when she had buried that sparrow. "The wing is broken," she said, looking up at Quinn. "I think I can splint it if we have something small enough." Quinn found small sticks and strips of cloth, and together they carefully immobilized the bird's wing. Penelope made a nest in a small box and placed the bird inside, setting it in a quiet corner of the cabin where it would be safe from predators. "Do you remember the day we met?" Quinn asked as they worked together. "You were burying a dead bird, and I thought you were the most unusual person I had ever encountered." Penelope smiled. "I remember thinking you looked terrifying at first, this huge bearded mountain man watching me from the trees. Then you spoke, and your voice was so gentle, and I thought maybe you were not terrifying at all. That bird you buried changed my life," Quinn said seriously. "If you had not stopped to show it that kindness, I would have ridden past without a word. I would have gone to Rawlins, bought my supplies, and gone back to being alone and miserable in my cabin. But watching you care for something so small and broken made me think that maybe I could be cared for too, that maybe my own broken places could heal." Penelope set down the cloth she had been holding and took Quinn's hands in hers. "You were never as broken as you thought you were," she said softly. "You were grieving, and grief is not the same as being broken. But yes, I think we helped heal each other. You showed me that life could hold joy again after loss, that loving someone new did not mean betraying the memory of someone gone." Quinn pulled her close, careful not to jostle the box with the injured bird. "I love you, Penelope Yates. I love the life we have built together. I love our son. I love waking up every morning knowing you will be beside me. You buried my sorrows and planted new joy in me, just like you plant seeds in that garden of yours. You made me whole again. We made each other whole," Penelope corrected, her voice thick with emotion. "And we will keep doing it, every day, for the rest of our lives." The injured bird recovered slowly over the following weeks. Penelope cared for it patiently, feeding it with an eyedropper, changing its bedding, talking to it while she worked. Quinn teased her gently about having another baby to care for. But he loved watching her tend to the creature with such devotion. On a bright morning in late July, they took the bird outside and carefully removed the splint. The wing had healed well, and after a few tentative flaps, the bird took flight. It circled their clearing once, twice, 3 times, as if saying goodbye or thank you or perhaps just reveling in its freedom, and then disappeared into the vast blue sky. Penelope watched it go with tears on her cheeks, and Quinn wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "You did good," he murmured. "Gave it a second chance." "We all deserve second chances," Penelope replied, turning in his arms to face him. "I think that is what I learned from you, what you taught me through your own healing. Life knocks us down, breaks us sometimes. But we can heal if someone cares enough to help. And then we get to fly again." James began to fuss in his basket, and they broke apart to tend to him, their movements easy and coordinated from weeks of practice. Quinn lifted his son while Penelope prepared to nurse, and they settled together on the cabin steps in the warm sunshine. "What do you think he will be when he grows up?" Quinn asked, watching James's tiny hand wrap around his finger. "Happy," Penelope said immediately. "That is what matters most. Whatever he chooses to do, wherever he goes, I want him to be happy and know he is loved." "He will know," Quinn promised. "We will make sure of it. He will grow up with both his histories, knowing that people can lose everything and still find their way back to joy. He will learn to honor the dead by living fully, to show kindness to broken things, to never give up on healing even when it seems impossible." They sat together, watching the valley below, the three of them forming a complete unit, a family forged from loss and grief, but sustained by love and hope. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their story, shelter for their dreams. Years passed in the way they do, marked by small moments that accumulated into a life fully lived. James grew into a sturdy little boy with Quinn's dark hair and Penelope's green eyes, curious and kind-hearted and fearless in the way of children raised with love and security. 2 years after James was born, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Clara Sarah, honoring both their lost loved ones and giving their son a sister to protect and play with. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with children's laughter. Quinn expanded it, adding a second room for the children and a proper kitchen for Penelope. They built a barn for their growing collection of animals, chickens and goats, and a milk cow that the children loved to help tend. Penelope's garden flourished, providing vegetables through summer and preserved goods through winter. Quinn's trapping business expanded as his reputation for quality furs grew. He hired occasional help during busy seasons, young men from Rawlins, who were willing to work hard in exchange for learning the trade. But he always made sure to be home most nights, unwilling to miss his children's childhoods, determined to be present in a way he had not been able to be for Margaret. Penelope started the lending library she had dreamed of, housing it in a small addition to the barn. Ranch families from throughout the valley would ride in once a month to exchange books, and Penelope would spend hours discussing literature and answering questions and gently encouraging children to develop a love of reading. It was not the same as teaching in a proper school, but it filled the need she had for intellectual engagement and service to others. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Quinn and Penelope would sit together on their porch, watching stars appear over the mountains, talking about their day, or sometimes just enjoying the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. They still visited the graves, Quinn's first family and Penelope's sister, bringing flowers in summer and clearing snow in winter, teaching their children about the people who had come before, making sure those memories stayed alive and honored. When James was 7 and Clara was 5, they took the children to the spot where Quinn had first seen Penelope burying the sparrow. Quinn told the story while Penelope added details, their children listening with wide eyes to this origin story of their family. "So Mama was burying a bird, and that made you fall in love?" James asked skeptically, his child's mind trying to understand the complexities of adult emotion. "It made me notice her," Quinn corrected. "It made me see that she was someone special, someone who cared about things other people overlooked. The falling in love part took longer, but it started right there with that one act of kindness." "I want to bury birds too," Clara announced decisively. "So someone will fall in love with me someday." Penelope laughed and pulled her daughter close. "You can bury birds if you want to, sweet girl. But do it because it is the right thing to do. Because even small lives matter. Not because you are trying to impress anyone. The right person will love you for who you are, not for what you do to get their attention." They visited Rawlins regularly, the whole family making the journey several times a year for supplies and social connection. The town had grown considerably since Quinn and Penelope first met. New businesses opening, more families settling in the area. The rough edges of frontier life slowly giving way to something more civilized. But Quinn and Penelope preferred their mountain home, the space and freedom it offered, the chance to raise their children with values they believed in, rather than having those values dictated by society's expectations. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Penelope back to the clearing where they had their first real conversation, the place where she had told him that even small things deserved to be honored in death. He had prepared a picnic, simple food but thoughtfully arranged, and they sat together in the grass, watching their children play nearby. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinn asked. "Giving up teaching, living so far from town, having a life so different from what you planned?" Penelope considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that Clara did not get to see me happy again. I regret that Sarah and Margaret never got the life they deserved. But do I regret building this life with you? Never. Not for one single moment. You gave me back my joy, Quinn. You showed me that loving and losing does not mean you should stop loving. Every day with you and our children is a gift." Quinn kissed her then, slow and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of deep love and enduring commitment. "You saved me," he said when they finally parted. "I was drowning in grief, and you threw me a lifeline without even knowing it. That morning when I found you burying that bird, I was so lost. But you showed me that gentleness and compassion still existed in the world, that there were still reasons to keep living. You did not just bury my sorrows, Penelope. You planted something new in their place, something that grew into this beautiful life we share. We saved each other," Penelope insisted, as she always did when Quinn tried to give her all the credit. "That is what love does. It takes two broken people and makes them whole together." They stayed in the clearing until the sun began to set, watching their children chase butterflies and pick wildflowers, talking about their plans for the future, dreaming about the years still ahead of them. James wanted to be a trapper like his father. Clara insisted she would be a teacher like her mother had been. And Quinn and Penelope smiled at their children's certainty while knowing that life would surprise them with plans they could not yet imagine. As darkness fell and they rode back to the cabin, James asleep against Quinn's chest and Clara drowsing in Penelope's arms, Quinn felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, hollow and hurting, convinced that his life was over in every way that mattered. He thought about the woman who had stopped to honor a fallen sparrow, who had shown him through that simple act that the world still contained beauty and meaning. Their cabin came into view, lamplight glowing warm in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney into the star-filled night. It looked like home, like safety, like everything Quinn had thought he would never have again. He glanced at Penelope riding beside him, her copper hair gleaming in the moonlight, her face peaceful and content, and felt his heart swell with love so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you," he said softly, not wanting to wake the children, "for stopping that day, for burying that bird, for seeing something in me worth saving." Penelope smiled at him, that same gentle smile that had first captured his attention a decade ago. "Thank you for stopping too," she replied, "for not just riding past, for being brave enough to risk your heart again, for building this beautiful life with me." They put the children to bed together, moving quietly through familiar routines, then stepped outside to look at the stars one more time before sleep. Quinn wrapped his arms around Penelope from behind, and they stood together in the mountain silence. Two people who had found each other in the midst of grief and created something lasting and true. "I love you," Quinn murmured into her hair. "I love you too." Penelope replied, leaning back against his solid strength. Today, tomorrow, and for all the years we have left. And there on their mountain, surrounded by the wilderness that had witnessed both their sorrows and their joys, Quinn and Penelope Yates stood together, proof that broken things could heal, that love could bloom from the ashes of loss, that kindness shown to even the smallest creature could change the course of a life. Their story had begun with a buried bird and a moment of unexpected connection. And it continued now in the laughter of their children, the warmth of their home, the deep, abiding love they shared. The mountains stood eternal around them. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and two hearts that had been shattered by grief beat strong and steady. Whole again because they had found each other, because they had chosen to honor their losses by embracing life, because they had learned that the greatest act of courage is allowing yourself to love again, after loss has taught you how much loving can hurt. Their story was not one of forgetting or replacing what had been lost. Sarah and Margaret, Clara the sister, they remained part of the fabric of this family, remembered and honored and woven into the ongoing narrative. But Quinn and Penelope had learned that the human heart is vast enough to hold both grief and joy, that remembering the dead and celebrating the living are not opposing forces, but complementary ones. As they finally turned to go inside, Quinn paused at the door and looked back at the mountains one last time. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a bird called out, and another answered, the sound carrying across the valley like a promise. Life continued in all its complexity and beauty, and Quinn and Penelope were no longer just surviving it. They were living it fully, embracing every precious moment, teaching their children through example that love is always worth the risk, that kindness matters, that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone if we are brave enough to reach out and connect with another soul. They closed the door on the night and stepped into the warmth of their home, their children sleeping peacefully in the next room, their futures stretching out before them, full of unknown joys and challenges they would face together. And if someone had asked Quinn in that moment whether he believed in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility of finding happiness after devastating loss, he would have pointed to his wife, his children, his life, and said without hesitation that he believed in all of it, that he was living proof that the darkest grief could give way to the brightest joy if you were willing to keep your heart open to possibility. The story of a mountain man and a schoolteacher who met over a buried bird was not just their story anymore. It was becoming a legend in the valley, a tale told by neighbors and passed down to children, a reminder that sometimes the smallest moments contain the seeds of the greatest changes. And though neither Quinn nor Penelope sought fame or recognition, they were quietly grateful that their love might inspire others to show kindness, to risk connection, to believe that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. Years continued to pass, as years do, and their family grew and changed. James did become a trapper, working alongside his father through his teenage years before eventually starting his own business, guiding hunting expeditions in the mountains. Clara surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, traveling to San Francisco for medical school and returning to Rawlins to open a practice, the first female physician in the territory. Quinn and Penelope watched their children grow with pride and occasional heartache, letting them go when necessary, but always keeping the cabin ready for their return. They aged together, Quinn's dark hair going silver, Penelope's copper fading to a softer auburn threaded with white. Quinn's body, so strong and capable in youth, began to slow down, his joints stiff from years of hard work in harsh conditions. Penelope's eyes grew weaker, requiring spectacles for reading. But her mind stayed sharp, and her spirit remained as gentle and determined as the day Quinn first saw her. On an autumn morning in 1909, exactly 30 years after they first met, Quinn and Penelope stood together in the same clearing where their story had begun. They had made a pilgrimage here every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, a private tradition they shared, a way of honoring the moment that had changed everything. 30 years, Penelope marveled, her hand clasped in Quinn's. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. It has been a good lifetime, Quinn said, his voice still deep and strong despite his 72 years. The best I could have imagined. They stood in comfortable silence, remembering. The clearing had not changed much, though the trees were taller and the mountains wore more snow on their peaks even in early fall. But the essence of the place remained the same, peaceful and beautiful and somehow sacred. Do you think the bird knew? Penelope asked suddenly. That sparrow I buried. Do you think it knew that its death would lead to all of this? To our meeting? To James and Clara? To all the love and joy we have shared? Quinn smiled at the whimsical question, so typical of his wife's thoughtful nature. I do not think birds concern themselves much with the impact they have on human lives, he said. But I like to think that in some cosmic way, yes, it mattered. Every life matters, every death matters, every small act of kindness ripples out in ways we cannot predict or measure. You taught me that. You taught me that grief does not have to be the end of the story, Penelope replied. That loving again after loss is not betrayal, but the highest form of honoring those we have lost. You taught me to be brave. They walked slowly back to their horses, moving with the careful deliberation of people who had earned their aches and pains through decades of hard work and full living. The ride home took longer than it once did, but neither minded. They had learned long ago that the journey mattered as much as the destination, that rushing through life meant missing the beauty along the way. Back at the cabin, they found both their children waiting for them, along with James's wife and 3 children, and Clara's husband and 2 children. It was a full house, noisy and chaotic and wonderful. They had dinner together. 3 generations gathered around the table Quinn had built with his own hands 40 years ago, sharing food and stories and laughter. As the evening wound down and families prepared to leave, James pulled Quinn aside. Pa, he said quietly, I have been meaning to ask you something. Clara and I have been talking, and we want to make sure the cabin stays in the family, that your and Ma's story gets preserved properly. Would you be willing to write it down? Or let Clara interview you and record everything? Quinn looked at his son, this man who carried his features and his love of the mountains, but was entirely his own person. Why does it matter? He asked. It is just a story about 2 people who met and fell in love. It is more than that, James insisted. It is a story about hope and healing, about how kindness matters, how love can survive loss, how broken people can become whole again. Those are lessons worth preserving, Pa. Your grandchildren should know where they come from, what their grandparents overcame to build this life. Quinn felt Penelope's hand slip into his. She had come up beside him without his noticing, the way she had been doing for 30 years. He's right, she said softly. Our story is worth remembering, worth sharing. Not because we are special, but because the truths we learned are universal. Everyone experiences loss. Everyone struggles with grief. If our story can help someone else find their way back to joy, is not that worth preserving? So Quinn agreed. And over the following months, he and Penelope sat with Clara while she carefully recorded their history. They told her everything, from that first meeting in the clearing to the life they had built together, holding nothing back, making sure she understood both the sorrow and the joy, the loss and the gain, the ending and the beginning. Clara typed up their words on her new typewriter, creating a manuscript she titled The Sparrow's Gift. She had copies made and distributed to family members, and eventually, with Quinn and Penelope's reluctant permission, she submitted it to a small publishing house in Denver. It was published as a slim volume 2 years later, selling modestly but touching the hearts of those who read it. Letters began to arrive at the cabin from strangers who had read their story, people who were struggling with their own grief and loss, who found comfort and hope in knowing that others had walked that dark path and found their way back to light. Quinn was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but Penelope reminded him that sharing their pain and healing might ease someone else's burden. And how could that be anything but good? They answered every letter personally, Penelope's neat handwriting filling page after page with thoughtful responses, Quinn adding his own perspective when words seemed necessary. It became a new form of their old work, Penelope teaching and Quinn protecting, both of them offering whatever comfort and wisdom they had gained through their years together. On a clear spring morning in 1915, Quinn woke to find sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and Penelope still sleeping peacefully beside him. He lay quietly, watching her breathe, memorizing the lines of her face, the curve of her shoulder, the way her hair spread across the pillow. At 78, he knew that every morning was a gift, that time was growing short, that the day would come when one of them would wake to find the other gone. But not today. Today they would have breakfast together, work in the garden Penelope still tended with such care, sit on the porch in the afternoon sunshine, share the accumulated memories of 36 years of marriage and 56 years of life. Today they would hold hands and talk and simply be together. And that was enough. That was everything. Penelope stirred and opened her eyes, finding Quinn watching her. She smiled, that same gentle smile that had first captured his attention so many years ago. "Good morning," she murmured. "Good morning," Quinn replied, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "I love you." "I love you too," Penelope said, as she had said thousands of times before, and would say thousands of times more if they were blessed with that many days. They rose together and began their day. Two people who had found each other in the midst of grief and built a life on the foundation of that chance meeting. The mountains rose around their cabin, eternal and unchanging, silent witnesses to the enduring power of love and kindness and the courage to keep living, even when living seems impossible. Their story was coming to its natural conclusion, but the lessons they had learned and shared would continue, passed down through children and grandchildren, preserved in Clara's manuscript, living on in the hearts of strangers who had read about a mountain man and a schoolteacher who met over a buried sparrow and found redemption in each other's arms. And if sometimes, in the quiet of evening, Quinn thought about that morning in 1879 when he had been contemplating whether life held anything worth living for, he thanked whatever force had led his steps to that clearing, to that woman burying that bird with such tender care. She had saved him, though she had not known he needed saving. She had shown him that the world still contained beauty and goodness, that his heart could heal, that love could bloom again from the ashes of devastating loss. Penelope, for her part, never forgot the sight of Quinn watching her from the trees, huge and wild-looking, but with such gentleness in his eyes. She had been lost too that morning, adrift in grief, uncertain whether she had made the right choice in coming to Wyoming. But he had helped her, and in helping her, he had given her a reason to stay, to build a life in this harsh, beautiful place, to believe that she could be happy again, They had saved each other, these two broken people, and in saving each other, they had created something lasting and true, a family and a home, and a love that had sustained them through everything life threw at them. And now, as their time together drew toward its inevitable close, they could look back without regret, knowing they had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world a little better than they found it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, birds sang in the trees around the cabin, and Quinn and Penelope Yates began another day together, grateful for the gift of each moment, thankful for the chance encounter that had changed everything, forever united by the tender act of showing kindness to even the smallest of creatures. Their love story was proof that the darkest night gives way to dawn, that broken hearts can heal, that in our willingness to be vulnerable and open and kind lies the possibility of transformation and joy. And so they lived, and so they loved. And when their story finally ended many years later, they left behind a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of something far more valuable. Proof that choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair can transform not just one life, but generations to follow. The sparrow's gift had been their meeting, but their gift to the world was the example of their lives, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to love, and to find joy even in the aftermath of devastating sorrow.